The LA Chargers might have just hit rock bottom. A promising young team that had aspirations to become NFL champions at some point now sit at 4-6 and their future is extremely unclear. Despite Justin Herbert playing some really good football and the LA Chargers offense being one of the better units in the entire NFL, they sit at the number 4 spot in the AFC West, which has teams like the Las Vegas Raiders and the Denver Broncos. And with a joke of a head coach in Brandon Staley, where do the LA Chargers go from here? And do I think this team has any chance of becoming the contenders they want to be? Well, I'm going to answer those questions plus some more in this video. Make sure you stay tuned for the full video because at the very end of this video, I'm going to be talking about the future of the LA Chargers and when I think they can actually contend for Super Bowls. With that all being said, let us finally begin. And I think the best way to start off this video is just going to be trying to figure out where this team is actually having problems at. Because despite averaging 25.9 points per game, which is the 8th highest in the NFL, and having top 10 stats in almost every statistical offensive stat, this team can still not find consistent ways to win games. And statistically speaking, it's pretty obvious. This defense is horrible and they're the reason why this team is losing games. And you want to know who's calling the plays on the defensive side of things? Their head coach, Brandon Staley. On defense, they give up 23.8 points per game, which is the 23rd worst in the NFL. They also rank 31st in opponents' yards per game, 25th in opponents' touchdowns per game, and 29th in opponents' yards per play. Now, in case you're curious as to what these teams are doing to the LA Chargers, it's pretty simple. They are passing the football a ton. On average, teams typically pass the ball on 62.67% of their plays, and very often they have a ton of success doing that. Just hear these god-awful stats from their pass coverage defense. They rank 26th in opponents' completion percentage, they rank 31st in opponents' yards per pass, they rank 30th in opponents' passes per game, they rank 32nd, which is dead last in the NFL, in opponents' pass yards per game, and in case you guys thought there was any saving grace with the turnover battle, they don't get turnovers either. On average, the opponents throw an interception on 1.54% of plays, which is the 28th worst in the entire NFL. So in case you guys are wondering, none of those rank anywhere near where you want them to be. Well, what about in the rushing department? Well, teams don't really feel a need to run the ball because on average, they only do it 37% of the time. And when they do run the ball, they don't really see a ton of success. For the most part, the rush defense for the LA Chargers is pretty average to good. And that's in big part due to the front 7 of that team. But when it comes to pass coverage, like I mentioned earlier, it is god-awful. And again, I want to reiterate, their defensive play caller is their head coach in Brandon Staley. How this guy still has a job after all the mediocre stuff he's been doing these past couple years is beyond me. I truthfully do feel like this team is just waiting for the end of the season to get rid of this guy because there's nothing in this world that's telling me that Brandon Staley has any promise of being an even decent head coach. The LA Chargers have not won a playoff game under him, and hell, they've barely even made the playoffs with him, despite having talented players like Derwin James, Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, the list goes on and on. I'm sorry, but if you give this team to a decent or even average head coach, I think they make the playoffs really consistently, and I think they have success within the playoffs. And I truthfully think one of the most horrendous takes that people have on this LA Chargers team is that they don't win games because of their quarterback Justin Herbert. Because I'm sorry, he puts up phenomenal stats year after year and they just don't win games. And sure, there are definitely some games where Justin Herbert has potentially lost them a game or two, but at the end of the day, wins are not a quarterback stat. Because if we were going off of that, then Jimmy Garoppolo with the San Francisco 49ers was one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Same thing applies to Brock Purdy, but of course, he's not. On the year, Justin Herbert has 2,609 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. And for his entire career, which is now at 4 years, he has 16,698 yards, 113 touchdowns, and 40 interceptions. This is one of the best quarterbacks in the entire NFL, but consistently gets disrespected because of how bad his head coach is. I'm sorry, but give this guy Ben Johnson or one of these talented offensive coordinated minds, I think this team is 10-7, 11-6, 12-5 plus every single year. And I think a big reason why they would be that successful is because Justin Herbert finally has a competent head coach to help him win games. Because right now, the reason why this team is winning games is because of Justin Herbert. Not to mention, it's not like this team has done a great job of surrounding Herbert with a ton of talent. Keenan Allen has been a rock-steady player for this team for several years, but he is well into his 30s at this point. Austin Eckler is a complete shell of himself at this point in his career, which is really bizarre because last year he was phenomenal. Mike Williams is a banged-up receiver that can just never take that next step. They just drafted Quentin Johnson over some really talented receivers like Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison, and he looks like a complete bust right now. I do want to briefly talk about Quentin Johnson. I don't want to bash on the kid too much because I actually grew up watching him for several years and I think he has some talent, but man, that drop was ugly this last week. But moving past him, the only really good thing this team has done has been drafting some decent offensive linemen to help keep Justin Herbert upright. And I also like the idea of bringing in Kellen Moore to be his offensive coordinator. I do think that moving forward, Kellen Moore should be the guy who stays with Herbert. So yeah, as I've kind of talked about and rambled about these past couple minutes, this team is a complete mess and a complete disaster. They have become mocked by almost every person in the media because of how horrendously bad this team is being coached at the moment, which brings me to my next point. how can this team finally get back to where they want to be? And honestly speaking, it's really not that difficult. For starters, you fire Brandon Staley and bring in an offensive-minded guy to bring in his philosophies for this unit. And hell, if you have that much confidence in Kellen Moore, then bring in a defensive guy who can help this defense be good again. I have 4 names in mind, 2 offensive guys and 2 defensive guys, and the 2 offensive guys I've talked about in great detail in other videos, so I'll briefly talk about them. Ben Johnson and Press Taylor would be my 2 top options. Ben Johnson is the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions, and obviously that team is having so much success with Jared Goff at the quarterback. That team is predicated on the run game, which I definitely do think is something that they can potentially look at for this LA Chargers team. Press Taylor is the offensive coordinator for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and while I think that Press Taylor would be a bit of a risky option, if you do want to go down the youthful route, I do think he could be a great head coach at some point. Now defensively is where it gets a little bit more interesting. I would like to see this team go after 2 guys, Raheem Morris and Dan Quinn. And I'll also throw a bonus pick out there. Steve Wilks, the defensive coordinator for the 49ers, would also be kind of an interesting pick as well. Dan Quinn is the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys, and obviously he can bring in that man coverage identity that a lot of teams are starting to move to nowadays. He was obviously the former head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, and I think that would be an experienced guy who's kind of had time to reflect, and I think he'd be a great pick for this team. The only question would be if he would actually leave Dallas, but I think if you gave him the right amount of money, I could see it. Raheem Morris is very similar in a lot of ways to Dan Quinn. I think he'd bring a young energy that a guy similar to what the Houston Texans have in DeMeco Ryans could bring to this unit. Steve Wilks would be a guy if you want to bring in a veteran presence to kind of just settle everything down. Again, I don't really love that one because I think he kind of is what he is. So my personal favorite of the 4 guys I mentioned would be Dan Quinn. I think that right there would solve so many problems this team currently has. The next thing that you would have to do is kind of address a couple small problems on this team. For starters, I'm sorry Austin Eckler, I just don't think you're the guy anymore. You can keep him on the roster and still have him as a lead back as more of a pass option threat, and I'm totally okay with that. But in my opinion, this team has to spend some serious draft capital to go out there and get a top-notch running back in this upcoming draft or maybe a future draft. And if you are the Chargers and you don't want to go out there and spend draft capital on a running back, I would love to see them get Saquon Barkley. He may be a bit of an older running back, but he still has that juice, and I think he'd be a nice 1-2 combination with Austin Eckler. I don't necessarily think that you go out there and get a receiver. At the end of the day, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are a great 1-2 combination, and hopefully a guy in Quentin Johnson can make that next step for next year. Offensive line-wise, it's one of the better units in the entire NFL. I do think the right side is a little bit weaker than the left side though, but I think ultimately maybe you add some depth, maybe add a future right guard, but for now I don't think it's that big of a deal. But defense is where it gets a lot more interesting. Again, if you are going to go down the Dan Quinn route, you're going to have to find some guys who know how to play some man coverage, and Dan Quinn loves his versatile players, and I think a guy like Derwin James would be an ultimate X factor for that defense. You already have a great defensive line with Joey Bosa, Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, and of course Khalil Mack. I think going out there and getting a truly great linebacker to replace Eric Kendricks would be a smart move. Kenneth Murray is young, but he struggles in pass coverage sometimes, and I just don't think he has the instincts to play a reliable linebacking role, so I think that might be a potential replacement option. By the way, Darius Leonard just got released, so potentially the Chargers should go out there and make a move for him. I doubt they do, but hey, it'd be interesting. And for the most part in the secondary, I think you have to overhaul a ton of it. Obviously, Asante Samuel Jr. is a great player, but I just don't think they're utilizing him in the way he should be used. If I was the Chargers, I would put a lot of investment in the secondary to try to fix a lot of your problems. Again, teams are basically bullying this defense in the pass game. This team is getting pressure, they're getting sacked, the front 7 is doing their job, but the back half of the defense is not. And that's obviously very concerning, especially in a Dan Quinn system or potentially another system that might run some man coverage a lot more. You're not going to have a lot of success with that. Now, I'm a lot more optimistic about this LA Chargers team than a lot of other people are, and it's kind of the same reason why I was very optimistic about the future of the Buffalo Bills. At the end of the day, you have your quarterback problems figured out. Justin Herbert's not going anywhere, and he's going to continue to be one of the better quarterbacks in the entire NFL. Similarly, the Buffalo Bills had this same situation just last week where I made a video on their future and everything they had going on, but when you have a starting quarterback of the caliber of a Josh Allen or Justin Herbert, you're going to be fine. It might take a little bit longer than what you would like to finally get into contending mode, but again, with Justin Herbert, you have a chance. And in my opinion, it takes one very successful draft and offseason to overhaul everything you've done. And the good news for the Chargers is that this year you're probably going to have a decent draft pick. Looking at the future of their schedule, they do have some tough matchups against the Baltimore Ravens, the Denver Broncos, as well as the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs. There are a ton of very losable games for this LA Chargers team, so you're more than likely going to end up with a top 15 pick. So hopefully with that draft pick, you can go out there and potentially take someone to replace a big hole on your team. And if they can find some success doing that, then I think this team is going to successfully be able to to reboot their system. This is a team that doesn't necessarily need to rebuild. It just needs a soft reboot to get things going back in the right direction. Obviously, you're going to have to figure out the age issues with guys like Keenan Allen, Joey Bosa, and Khalil Mack, but for right now, those guys are still playing at a very good level, and as time goes on, you're going to find new guys to replace those guys. So you don't have to refix every single problem you have this offseason, just address enough of them to keep you in contending mode, and then every single year just add new pieces and new options to help your team out. This is going to be a unbelievably huge offseason for the LA Chargers and the rest of their future, because if they want Justin Herbert to be the Super Bowl leading quarterback for this team, they got to start this offseason officially. But LA Chargers and NFL fans, let me know in the comment section below what you guys think about the LA Chargers. Do you guys think they have a chance to potentially win a Super Bowl within the next 5 years? And if so, let me know why. And if you did enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it would help me out an absolute ton. But I love you guys. Peace.